This is the Tech Ed Podcast. I am your host, Matt Kirchner. Now, a few short weeks ago, I was on a phone call with the governor of the great state of North Dakota, Doug Burgum, himself a former guest here on the Tech Ed Podcast. We were talking about precision agriculture and AI and edge to cloud. He said, "You've met Greg Tehven, haven't you?" And I said, "Governor, I have to admit I have not." And he shook his head. I could tell over the phone that he was shaking his head and saying, "You have to meet Greg. He is amazing." Well, a week or so after that, I had the opportunity to meet Greg Tehven. He is our guest on the Tech Ed Podcast. In this episode, he is the co-founder and CEO of Emerging Prairie. We're going to learn all about the great work that he's doing in the world of entrepreneurship. He is also the board chair and co-founder of an incredible operation called Grand Farm that I had the opportunity to visit. It is amazing the scale on which they are focusing on precision agriculture in the state of North Dakota. We're going to talk all about that on this episode, and it is my pleasure to welcome to the virtual studio of the Tech Ed Podcast, Greg Tehven. Greg, awesome to see you.
Thanks so much for having me. What an honor.
Well, it's an honor to have you, and it's an honor to be talking about the great things that you're doing in the state of North Dakota. We're going to start with a little bit of your background, a huge background in entrepreneurship and startups and coming up with great ideas, making amazing things happen. Let's start with that. Did you always know you wanted to be involved with entrepreneurship, to be an organizational leader? When did that start for you, Greg?
Well, I give so much credit to my parents. I grew up in a rural community, fifth generation family farmer, gravel roads everywhere. And I grew up in this agriculture background where if somebody needed help, the neighbors got together. We didn't have volunteerism or service learning. We just had kind of showing up for folks. And so I grew up kind of in an isolated environment. So if I wanted to have a backyard baseball game, I had to get the country kids to come over on a Tuesday to get the closest town kids, and we'd have a baseball game. And I realized that I needed to start things. I needed to start our Fellowship of Christian Athletes program. I needed to start the intramural basketball program. I just kind of took initiative. I saw that from my parents. I saw that from my community. And when I was a senior in high school, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And my Spanish teacher, Kathy Scott, said, "You know, Greg, I don't know if the job that you're going to have in the future exists right now, and you might just have to create it." And that's when I learned what entrepreneurship was. I read a book by Tiger Woods about start something, and I was like, oh, that makes sense. I don't have to get a job. I can create one.
You know, as you mentioned, first of all, Kathy Scott and the incredible influence that she had on your career pathway. We talk a lot on the podcast, and I'm a big believer that every one of us, regardless of our education pathway, can point to three people, three teachers, instructors, professors that had a huge impact on our lives. And it was always somebody that showed us that we had an ability that we didn't know we had, or an interest. They uncovered an interest that we didn't know was there, or showed us that we could be thinking about something totally different than where we thought we were going for our career, for our future. And it's amazing that here was a Spanish teacher that said something to you like, hey, you can have a job that doesn't exist yet, kind of spur that whole idea of entrepreneurship, that interest in starting things. So you had some really early career experiences. In fact, when I first met you at Grand Farm, and we were going in search of hard hats, actually, and so we had a nice opportunity to get to know each other before we found the hard hats to wear into your construction site. And I asked you, I said, tell me about your background. And the very first thing you talked about was Students Today, Leaders Forever, which was an organization that you fired up when I believe you were still in college, if I'm not mistaken. Tell us a little bit about how some of those early career experiences turned you into the entrepreneur that you are today, Greg.
Yeah, I mean, so imagine being a rural country kid from North Dakota going to the University of Minnesota, the only Big Ten school in an urban environment, 50,000 students. I think the University of Minnesota would have been the second largest city in North Dakota. And so I'm a freshman, I'm ambitious. I had just got done spending my summers volunteering at leadership camps through the National Association of Student Councils, both in the United States and in Sydney, Australia. And I was one of those kids when the guest speakers came in and they said, if you can dream it, you can do it. I believed them. They just said, hey, you should take a risk, solve problems, focus on things that you believe can be better. I was one of those kids that took notes and said, okay, I believe you. So I'm a freshman at the University of Minnesota. It's a couple days into the semester. I'm up late with a couple friends. One's a Filipino woman from LA, one's from the Twin Cities, and one's from a rural Minnesota town. And we start saying, what can we do to change the world? What would be interesting and what could be fun? And I had been in Sydney, Australia, where I learned about a pay it forward tour, where a group of folks got college age students together to do volunteerism experiences, volunteering in different cities and getting people to tell their stories. And so this is back in 2003. Pluto had just lost its planethood. It was kind of, internet was just getting going. It was pre-Facebook. And we said, what if we took our spring break and went across the U.S. and did volunteer projects in cities along the way? So that was in September. In March of 2004, 43 of us got on a bus. Everybody paid $400 to go. We self-organized. We planned the trips. We did service projects. We did tourism. And that kicked us off. We were those ambitious freshmen. We got the vice provost of student affairs to be our advisor. And he talked a lot about tolerance of ambiguity. How could we continue to move forward when there was uncertainty? And so 43 of us had this transformational experience. I still remember being in Canton, Ohio, working with their mayor, doing inner city cleanup. We went to Philadelphia, and the governor, Ed Rendell at the time, a Democrat, hosted us for a meeting and got us tickets to the Constitution Center. We end up in Washington, D.C., doing a project along the Anacostia River, and I'm 19 years old. I'm having a transformational experience. We built a social enterprise. I spent 7 years building it. I think we've taken over 30,000 young people on these service trips. We were named Social Entrepreneurs of the Year in Minnesota. And I'm so grateful for learning how to create my own job with my best friends. And I'm so grateful that in a few weeks, I'll be with those same founders and some of our early quote unquote customers or folks that attended, having a reunion. And although we're not doing that work anymore, we're still friends, we're active in our communities, and that applied learning environment, I think, is really special.
So it'd be almost the 20th anniversary then of the founding of that organization. So I'm sure probably that time went really, really fast. But that work so important. I've been on a number of mission trips with high school kids. In fact, for 6 or 7 years while my kids were that age, traveled all over the country. Very, very similar model where you go into a city that you're not necessarily familiar with. In fact, you mentioned the Anacostia River and you mentioned Washington, D.C. We actually did a mission trip there into that neighborhood, walking 30 young people down the streets to a nursing home in a neighborhood, frankly, that most of them probably wouldn't have seen otherwise. And just those transformational experiences where you see how other people live, you get to understand how you're different, but more important, how you're the same. And I think those are really great opportunities for young people, and in your case, college-age students that have this transformational experience. And it's got to be incredibly fulfilling to you to know that you took, tens of thousands of young people's lives and put them on a trajectory that they might not otherwise have been on. So incredible work. Really shows the power of starting something, shows the power of entrepreneurship. You really put those two things together with Emerging Prairie, both starting an organization, doing good work, and also focusing on the idea of entrepreneurship. Tell us a little bit about the organization. Where did it start and what's your mission?
Yeah, well, thanks. So after that experience with Students Today, Leaders Forever, I burned out. I was exhausted. Unfortunately, my ego was getting the best of me. I was more interested in sharing the data and the numbers and the impact versus the core work. And I knew I needed to change. So we activated our succession plan. We were those college kids that actually applied what we were learning, crisis communication, succession planning, because we were fortunate that we had a real life example. Learning was always real to us. What we were learning in the accounting class, we could apply in the business. And so I burned out. I was grateful for an opportunity to wander around the world. And I was meeting with Doug Burgum, who introduced us before I went, who's been a mentor and a friend and a coach. And he just said, Greg, you're not taking a year off, you're taking a year on. And he gave me some money and he just said, hey man, I just want you to just learn as much as you can while you're exploring the world. So I walked the Camino de Santiago in Spain. I spent 6 weeks in West Africa with Peace Corps volunteers in Burkina Faso and did a few other things. And when I got back, I was trying to figure out what to do. I just got a Rotary Ambassadorial Scholarship, so a full ride to study anywhere in the world, but I had to wait a year. And that's where Doug showed up again. He said, Greg, hey, come join my team. Work for me directly and learn as much as you can. So I'm like, okay, that sounds good. So I'm downtown Fargo. I'm learning about the connection between tech companies, venture capital, and real estate.
And let me just ask a question. So when you say join my team, what was Governor Burgum doing at that point in time, and in what organization are we talking about here?
Yeah, so this is the Kilborn Group. So this is post-acquisition of his software company, Great Plains Software, to Microsoft. He had just finished being the senior vice president of Microsoft. Satya Nadella had fulfilled his role upon completion, and he was reimagining downtown Fargo, a patient capital approach. So here I am, 26 years old. I get a chance to work for him personally. At the time, he was selling success factors to SAP. Atlassian was recruiting him to their board. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm getting to work for this guy. I'm learning about venture capital. I'm learning about real estate. I'm learning about philanthropy. And I'm seeing the best of America. I am seeing somebody that cares about his city, cares about vibrant communities. And I'm like, I don't want to go to grad school to study social change. I want to be a practitioner. And I looked at the landscape and I realized the community's approach to entrepreneurship had room for improvement. I remember being at a community event where they were talking about entrepreneurship, but the only people that got to speak were the successful entrepreneurs that had exits. Nobody on the edge was on stage. No high school kids were sharing their ideas. And I'm thinking we can do this better because, my experience building a company, it was those professors that let me speak in the MBA classes about what I was working on, or those first customers. Man, stuff was amazing. So a group of friends of mine and we said, let's tell the stories of entrepreneurs. So there was 4 of us that said, we're going to create an online content blog to tell the stories of entrepreneurs. But the challenge was the 4 of us couldn't write. I think the 4 of us collectively over the first 2 months produced 2 articles. So there was room for improvement. But I was good at events. And so we started hosting TEDx Fargo, started hosting a program through the Kauffman Foundation, 1 Million Cups. And then we hosted Startup Weekend. And our view of those kind of global networks was to be the best in the country, the best in the world for experience, quality, and results. And we started doing that. And we found a community. I remember after the first Startup Weekend, I think Phil Soren out of the Twin Cities, who's just this incredible philanthropist that just sold his companies for over $1 billion. He came back and was our speaker. And there's like 100 people in the restaurant on a Sunday night talking about their ideas. And all of a sudden I saw a community. I saw something more powerful than just entrepreneurship. I saw a community. And that's when I applied the work from undergrad from Robert Putnam from Bowling Alone. And in some of these thinkings that we need belonging, we need connection. And so I ended up turning down grad school to build Emerging Prairie. And that was, I think, 12 years ago now. And now we're a team of 40 folks. We focus on building 3 ecosystems, the entrepreneurial ecosystem, the technology ecosystem, and the innovation ecosystem. And we're just having the time of our life.
So how do people interested in entrepreneurship, interested in improving themselves in terms of, the startup community and so on, how do they plug in? How do they engage? Is it a membership model? Are you just doing best practices? Give us a little bit of a sense for that.
Yeah, it's our thesis is entrepreneurs need access to 3 things. They need access to each other, they need platforms to share their work, and they need customers. So we focus on the first 2, creating environments for entrepreneurs to meet each other and platforms to them to share their work, the problems they're solving, and letting the community support them. From a business model, we have a freemium model. So we have a weekly program called Startup Brew. There was 140 folks there today. We average about 150 people at that. That's all free. We have TEDx Fargo that we just had, 1,500 people there. We're not trying to monetize these opportunities. We're trying to build the energy, build the community. And that's where I'm so blessed to call this place home. We have philanthropists that support us, businesses that support us, and kind of a multi-sided marketplace where if we fill the room and create this energy, there's folks that are paying for that freemium, if you will, on the backside.
There's entrepreneurial groups all over the country, right? I mean, any one of us could probably name a half a dozen of them. And I'm hearing a few differentiators. Number one is the focus not just on the successful entrepreneur, but on the unsuccessful or yet to be successful one, or the budding entrepreneur, and recognizing that. Number 2 is really the focus is on the member and the experience and what they're learning. not on the economic model. It's not, we always talk about in the businesses we run, if your mission is big enough, the economics take care of itself. And it feels to me like that's a similar approach that you've got in Emerging Prairie. Are there other things that you would point to in terms of what really, really makes you unique?
Well, we're big believers in Brad Feld's work. He wrote Startup Communities that highlighted the Boulder thesis. We believe entrepreneurs should lead. Second is we value ecosystems. As I look at the federal government right now and their priorities, it's clear there's a shift to honoring and valuing ecosystems. We're very inspired by a gentleman from Palo Alto that runs Service Space, and he talks about designing for generosity. We're big advocates of the book The Go-Giver, which is all about generosity as a strategy that poses the question is, can you outgive your community? And we don't believe we can. The more we pour into our community, the more good happens. Our business model is this. We're like a tree. If a tree takes care of a community will water it, nourish it, and help it grow. And if the tree isn't adding any value, the community will let it die. That's our business model. I am so delighted by the amount of resources that come in, and we just focus on our mission, which is energizing communities to improve the human condition.
16 years ago, I did an interview with Gardner Business Media, and it was all about networking and building a network and so on. And the first question they asked me was, what's the key to building a network? And I said, just give without expecting anything in return. And then I meant it. I mean, if you are of that mindset that the more you give, the more comes back to you, that the more you focus on mission, the more successful your organization is going to be. And so really interesting that you would point to that aspect of your business model. I know, you mentioned the freemium model. You mentioned this whole idea of TEDx and the incredible success yet again of that event. So now that we've talked about that a couple of times, give our audience a little more of a flavor for what TEDx is all about.
Yeah, well, TEDx was, it started with TED. It was a high-end conference in the West Coast for years and years. It was kind of for the social elite. And then Chris Anderson, I believe he's a British journalist, acquired the responsibility of that brand. And he democratized it. He said, what would it look like for independently organized events throughout the world? And so I as I shared earlier, I wandered around the world for a year, and I got asked to give a talk at TEDx Twin Cities about my learnings. And I gave a talk on the unlearning curve and the things I had to unlearn to continue to take risks and add value. But when I was invited to speak, I just said to Chad Byrne, the organizer, hey, I'll do this if you help us organize TEDx Fargo. He said, sure, Greg. So I got coaching from just a great guy. And we started TEDx Fargo. And, Doug Burgum was one of the first 4 speakers we had. We had a great event in February that we did our second event. We sold out in 9 minutes. And here we are, 2024, and we've got one of the top TEDx events in the country. We've got over 200 alumni speakers, well over tens of millions of views. And we've got a situation where we've built a community within the TED platform at a global level. TEDx Fargo is the persona of the city lover. Our approach to TEDx Fargo is to write a love letter to our city. And we're trying to share ideas. We're trying to get, local folks connected to the travelers. We're trying to get people on holiday card lists and create magic and value. I mean, at our most recent event, Heartland Forward out of Bentonville, Arkansas, hosted a dinner for AI, and we have U.S. senators there and folks flying all in from the country, around the country to attend that dinner and go to our event. We had a 14-year-old who goes to MIT AI conferences giving a talk about how adults can learn and trust AI. We have 4 stars in the U.S. Navy introducing retailers from Shields. It's just so beautiful. And so we've been doing this, and we build a community around our speakers. We build a community around our sponsors, and there's all these unintended positive consequences where folks are more connected, ideas are moving forward. And our thesis is, if we're going to move the U.S. forward and we're going to move our world forward, it all starts with ideas. And ideas can come from 4th graders, and they can come from 80-year-olds and anywhere in between. And so we're really trying to create that environment for ideas. And our organization, if you look at the history of TEDx Fargo, it shaped our organization. It's where the idea of Grand Farm came from. It's where the software development school we run called Emerging Digital Academy came from. It has been the foundational platform for our organization.
And it all starts with ideas, with sharing ideas. And it's interesting. this whole idea of, and I'll kind of paraphrase what you said early in the podcast, which is, we heard about you can be anything you want to be, and I actually believe them, or we actually believed what we learned in our business classes in business school, or somebody said at a National Honor Society event, and believe me, I was never invited to those for a reason, and it's because I wasn't performing academically well enough to be there. But to have an individual say to you that share your dreams with everyone, and you're like, and I believe that. Is that kind of a core in terms of how you look at the world, is rather than being super, super skeptical of accepting things that you hear from people, ideas, suggestions, and running with them? It feels like that's a bit of a theme in your life.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for the question. It brings me back to my childhood, and I remember hearing all the talks in school about drunk driving. Don't drink alcohol because you'll kill someone driving drunk, right? I interpreted that as a young person as I don't drink alcohol, but other people do, so they're going to kill me. And thinking about that, I kind of feel like I've been living with house money. I've lived longer than I anticipated. I thought I was going to die by 17 or 18, totally irrational. And so I've just kind of had this freedom to take risks, to try things. And I always think as an entrepreneur, like, what's the worst thing that happens to me? I fail and I have to sleep on my buddy's couch for a while. Or if I fail, I have to work corporate and make more money. I mean, that's not that bad of an outcome. And so I've just really enjoyed the freedom of trying to solve really big problems. And we've talked about Doug Burgum a lot on this so far, but he was the one that invested me. He paid for me to go to Stanford. He gave me opportunities. But I watched somebody with small town North Dakota kids build a world-class company. I've watched him for the last couple of years run for president, and most folks thought he wouldn't have a chance. And, he maybe didn't get the outcome he wanted today, but he was in the arena. He took risks. And I'm always inspired by the folks that dream big. And Doug once told me, he's like, Greg, if you go for mediocrity, there's a lot of people with that goal. But if you're going to try to change the world, A, it's a lot of fun, and B, there's not a lot of competition, because it takes a lot of courage to tackle hard problems.
So how did you initially meet the governor? Just curious, how did you get connected? How was he inspired to help you in the ways that he was?
When I was a freshman at the University of Minnesota, a friend of mine told me she thought he would go on our first ever Pay It Forward tour. So I pitched him. He didn't come. Now I know that senior vice presidents of Fortune 100 companies don't go on college spring breaks with people they don't know. So that makes sense to me. It took me 4 years to get a meeting with him. Finally met him. We had a documentary that we had produced. I meet with him. I've never been in a meeting with somebody that has a note taker at it. I thought it was so weird. I asked him about work-life balance because everybody was telling me I needed to chill out. And he goes to me, Greg, some people think about work-life balance over the course of an hour or a week. I think about it over a lifetime. And he said something I'll always remember. He said, do you think Olympic athletes to win a gold medal have a balanced approach over the course of a week or a month? I said, well, no. He's like, yeah, they have it over a lifetime. You can take that approach. And it kind of gave me permission to keep working hard. So that was my senior year of college. He came to our documentary the next day, loved it. I ended up being the advisor of a group of high school kids that were running a food drive where they filled the Fargo Dome with cans of food. Ended up being the largest youth-led food drive in the country. I did that for 3 years. And we got his son involved when he was 15 because I know the power of service learning. And so I got to know his son, Joe, who just saw this morning. He's one of my really good friends. And I'm just really grateful for a family that has taught me a lot about generosity and caring and given me opportunities to pursue my dreams.
Greg Tehven, the co-founder and the chief executive officer of Emerging Prairie, the board chair and co-founder of Grand Farm, is our guest on the Tech Ed podcast, and we are going to continue with a little bit more shaping out of the discussion around the work that he's doing at Emerging Prairie before we get into Grand Farm. So many great things that you're doing, Greg. So many individuals that you're inspiring. I'd just be interesting of all the stories that I'm sure you could tell about entrepreneurs that you've helped, about people who have achieved great results as a result of being a part of the great things happening at Emerging Prairie. Do you have a story or two that stick out that you really want our audience to know about?
What a wonderful question. What pops to my mind is a past TEDx Fargo speaker. Her name is Beck Heinrich, an Australian woman, giving a talk about the power of rest and thinking about athletes and how they rest and how corporate folks and innovators, they too need to rest and that we don't need to be on all the time. So I'm like, that's really cool. But right after her was the dean of the University of Minnesota Medical School. And he started to talk about rare diseases and innovative approaches to both identify and solve rare diseases. So rare diseases being identified as situations that impact less than 1,000 people. So big pharma, big tech, they're not interested in it because it's not the market scale. So an Australian woman gives a talk on rest. The dean of the medical school from the University of Minnesota, who I think is from Eastern Europe, gives a talk on rare medical disease. And backstage, Beck says to him, "Oh my God, my best friend's kid has that disease you identified. Could you help?" And fast forward a few months, and that family gets better support. That kid gets better care. And I think, like, so often we focus on direct benefit. But what I love about Emerging Prairie, which is about energizing communities to improve the human condition, two unlikely people talking about divergent topics come together backstage in a spirit of, oh my goodness, that's a problem I have, and you're working on a solution. And it worked. And one family is a little bit better, and who knows what comes after that.
Right, absolutely. Well, it is amazing, regardless of folks' spiritual beliefs, how the universe has this way of creating some of those opportunities. I'm a big believer that coincidences are never a coincidence. I read a book years ago called The Celestine Prophecy that kind of goes into that whole idea. And so to be able to create that framework or that platform for those two individuals to have met each other, and knowing that without the incredible work that you're doing, that never would have happened. I'm sure that's one of just dozens and dozens of examples. But, it's interesting. A lot of times people would expect an answer like, oh, here was this entrepreneur and they tapped into our network and then they sold their company for, $5 billion or what, that's the story you expect. And I'm sure there's examples like that too, but beautiful that the one that sticks out to you is the one that says, hey, we were able to, for some purpose, maybe known or maybe unknown, put these two individuals together in a way that had a hugely impactful result on the life and the quality of life of that family. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. I want to pivot now to the work you're doing at Grand Farm. And I will tell you, it's probably been 3 weeks or so since I spent my time with you there, 20 miles west of Fargo, give or take. I think I finally got the last speck of dirt off of my dress shoes that was that was on there after that great visit that we had. I want you to help our audience understand the scale of which you're doing what you're doing at Grand Farm. When the governor suggested that I learn more about it, his words were, "You have to go see it," and he's right, because I think just explaining it in words it's almost impossible to explain the scale in which you're focusing on precision agriculture, an incredibly important part of your state's economy. But talk about this whole first what's going on at Grand Farm and where did the idea come from, and also how does agriculture and entrepreneurship, how do those two play together?
Yeah, well, it's so fun to talk about Grand Farm. Going back in time, one of our weekly programs, which we now call Startup Brew, was an entrepreneur giving a talk. So I would go meet with the speakers beforehand and get to know them. So I'm getting to know Barry Batchelor. And Barry is one of those enigmas in our area. He grew up on the streets of New York City, had some dysfunction within his family, was very inspired by the space race, and was looking for an educational opportunity he could afford. And he found North Dakota State University to study engineering. And then he discovers computers. And he put the first ever computer chip on a tractor. So at the time that Wozniak was putting the computer chip in our homes, he was putting it on a tractor. So he went on to build the first Steiger tractor, which was very critical in equipment. He sold one company to John Deere. That company is now John Deere Electronic Solutions, based out of Fargo. So the electronics for John Deere globally are designed and produced here in his community. And he most recently sold a company to AGCO. And so there's this brilliant guy, and he says, "Greg, what is our region's major?" What can we as a region do to make a difference that we have a reasonable chance of success and we have a right to exist? I'm like, I don't know, Barry. I have no idea. That's a great question. He's like, let's have drinks. So he does the speaking event. It was incredible. So we go have drinks, and he said, what's our region's major? And he's one of these engineers that just hammers the question. And so after a few adult beverages, and in full disclosure, my wife no longer allows me to spend time with Barry after 7 p.m., we started to think about advanced technology in agriculture, and we came up with some terrible ideas what we could do that. Robot parades, high school challenges that are not appropriate, all this kind of robot stuff. And we landed on this idea of Grand Farm. What would it look like to think about the big problems in the world that advanced technology in agriculture can solve? On-farm safety, on-farm utilization of like the efficiency from a productivity point of view, from a profitability point of view, thinking about policy to be technology forward, thinking about access to venture capital. At the time, North Dakota, there was this big study on the top venture capital firm in each state, and North Dakota got not available. We had no venture funds that were active in the state. And so we started to work on that. We formed a steering committee. First event, we had the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, kick things off, former governor of Georgia, and he's out there saying, I'm juiced, this is so exciting. Microsoft committed $1.5 million to get this idea off the ground. We built a software development school to support technology talent for the space called Emerging Digital Academy. And then Kevin and Stacy Bifford, some entrepreneurs, gave us 40 acres of land, and they just said, go figure it out. It's just been an incredible journey since. So where we are today, we organize, or we oversee 590 acres of land. We have a 25,000 square foot facility designed for hospitality. We have over 70 partners that are active in the Grand Farm, and we're having the time of our life. We've got an awesome team. We've won some very competitive federal opportunities lately through the CHIPS and Science Act and the National Science Foundation, and we're playing big in the world.
You know, it's amazing. We had Senator Todd Young on, looking at our producer as we speak, probably a year and a half ago. He was one of the co-sponsors of the CHIPS and Science Act, and talking about exactly this kind of innovation that would come as a result of that funding. And I can tell you, as just one of your funding sources, that it's paying on its promise, at least there in southeast North Dakota. You know, just to talk about the scale of this, and you mentioned the acreage, but it's just shy of a section of land, just side. But that 25,000 square foot facility, which I know is just the start of an entire campus that could result of this. You've got major agriculture organizations that are carving out huge slices of land in the space that you've got to perform innovation, research and development, in understanding this whole transformation and precision agriculture in the way that we can now, for everything, literally for people that don't follow it, everything from how we prepare the earth to how we perform our seeding to how we fertilize and how we irrigate and how we harvest. I mean, all of this is now edge to cloud. It's all smart technology, from that very first computer chip in a tractor to where precision agriculture is today. It's been a huge transformation, and it was just absolutely fascinating to see it. If we're looking into the future, Greg, what's the vision? Where is this going? I mean, you've got the one building. You've got, right now it's a building and it's a construction site coming along in the middle of a big slice of property. Tell us where this is all going.
Yeah, well, thanks for the questions, Matt. Let me try to slice this in a couple of ways. So dedicated in North Dakota and the headquarters, we're going to continue to expand our campus. We have 8 organizations, many of which you've heard of, some you haven't, looking at dedicated on-farm space. We're looking at a federal lab in artificial intelligence, making some progress there. Got some well-known organizations and the utilization of startups. And we think about a mall, right? A mall has the food court, and then there's people around it, and there's energy and activity. We've got our anchor tenant in AGCO. So we got our anchor tenant. We got momentum on the others coming. Then we got the ability for these trials. So our plot environments could be 1 to 20 acres. Well, some of these startups, they need to demonstrate at beyond proof of concept into larger environments. So that's the affiliated acres opportunity. So that's producers that say, hey, I really like this autonomous robot that removes invasive exotic species or weeds without chemicals. I want to pilot that, or I want to use Sabanto, this autonomous tractor solution for 300 acres or 3,000 acres. So we want to build that out. And so we see that happening. And then we just announced a partnership with the University of Georgia. So we'll be in Perry, Georgia. We're hiring some staff there, and we'll be adding staff in Bozeman, Montana. Or what we know about agriculture is every environment is different. The soil is different. The weather is different. There's difference between one state. There's difference between one section of land. But we know technology scales. And so as we expand into these multiple environments, we believe the ecosystems will get stronger and that we will all get better, because the beauty of our model is the producer is at the center. They're identifying pain points. They're sharing the challenges. At our conferences, we used to have an angry farmer panel, and it was pretty easy to find angry farmers to complain about the technology. They're like, hey, this big piece of equipment is autonomous. Why the hell can't my chair turn around 360 so I can look in the back? If I don't have to drive, why can't I look in the back? Or they're so practical. And what I love about producers is they're honest. They're direct. This is real life. These are not farmers. These are CEOs. These are decision makers. They're strategists. They're thinking about capital deployment. And so I just get so excited about building out a global ecosystem. And so as we think about it, the more connected folks are, the more we're learning. Barry, the thought leader of Grand Farm, talks about the sphere of knowledge. And as we increase the sphere of knowledge, whether it's AI or CRISPR, these new technologies, they help us. So I just get so excited about the collective learning, the sharing, the collaboration. I mean, we had this experience. We're really curious about space agriculture. I think the SBIR or somewhere in the federal government has a $250 million allocation to research and testing for food production in low orbit environments, aka space. I mean, this is what gave us the radish. Doug Hurley was the SpaceX pilot that went out and planted the radish or whatever. So we talk about that a lot. And at our grand opening at Grand Farm, I had my kids come. I've got a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 6-year-old. And I just want my kids to be there. I just want them to see this work. And so my wife, who's a saint, brings them. And I just assumed they were going to be in the back eating waffles and drinking juice and going to give me a hug after. But they listened to the program. And they heard Barry talk about space agriculture and the possibilities. And when I put my son to bed that night, he goes, hey, Dad, how are we going to farm in space? Because we had just been to NASA. How big's the rocket going to be to bring a tractor up? And hey, Dad, is there fertilizer on Mars? And how are we going to do that? And I thought to myself, God, he's way smarter than I am. But that's never been hard to prove. But I thought, oh my God, my kid, this generation, they're meeting the technology where it is. That's all they've ever known. He doesn't have to unlearn things. He doesn't have to unlearn how my grandfather farmed. He doesn't have to unlearn that when you go to the airport, you don't go to Mars yet. But he knows what Blue Origin is. And he's heard Musk's vision of possibility of human travel. And he's starting with the technology today. And that's what excites me about Grand Farm and getting young people involved, is they can start with the technology today. They don't have to be afraid of a drone. A drone's a drone. And it's just a tool.
As our producer Melissa often says, older people say, I wonder what happens if I push that button, and young people say, let's push that button and see what happens. And just that level of curiosity, and to think about a young person who, I'm guessing your son is, maybe first grade or even younger, and to be thinking about, really some complex questions, right? About what does space farming really look like, and how do you fertilize something on the planet Mars? I mean, those are really, really deep questions, but it also speaks to, when you spark that interest in a young person, when you show them technology they weren't aware of, when you allow them to start making some of these connections, this whole sphere of knowledge as you talk about, and looking at what might be working in one market and how you can apply it in another market. I mean, just this incredible future that's available to our young people, and it's really just a great example of not only the vision for Grand Farm, but also how when we expose young people to these technologies and these ideas that, they'll come up with ideas that many of us hadn't even thought of. It just really makes you in a lot of ways. And I certainly am, confident and excited for the future. And it's just it's a great time to be to be living. It's also a great time to be an entrepreneur. And in as much as, I love the Grand Farm focus on, on an emerging company and maybe, doing a trial of a product or testing a product for a producer to make sure that it works in the way that we think it could or should. That whole idea of entrepreneurship, some rapid questions for our young entrepreneurs, because we're talking now about, the next generation of leaders, the next generation of innovators. So if we focus on those folks, kids your kids' age, Greg, or maybe a little bit older, what would you tell them it takes to make a successful entrepreneur?
I think back to, whenever I have started things, I feel as if folks have deputized themselves to be the devil's advocate. Hey, Greg, I just got to let you know, how are you going to pay for health insurance? And I'm always like, I don't know. They'll ask, what's your 3-year forecast model? I'm like, yeah, I have no idea. What's your 5-year strategy? And I'm always like, well, I hope to be there tomorrow. And I think people believe with good intent that they're trying to be a devil's advocate to help you think about things. And I wish more folks would take the approach of, let me tell you all the reasons why I think it can work. Did anybody ask J.K. Rowling, like, when you send that book out, what if theme parks get created by your characters? What if you become a billionaire? I mean, this was a single mom that was rejected a ton of times, and she's like the most prolific author of our time. And I bet she didn't have a lot of people preparing her for success. And so when I meet with young people, I'm like, why do you think it can work? What would be exciting? How can we get you there faster? Maybe your idea is too small. Should it be 10 times bigger? When we build Students Today Leaders Forever, we were grateful for our first $25,000 donation. Like, we thought we had made it. Zuckerberg got $250 million for Facebook at the same time. Why aren't philanthropists, when startups and nonprofits are doing better, saying, I'm going to 10x my contribution to you, versus this foolish approach of, you're doing well, I think I'm going to pull back. And I think the same thing goes for young people. What if we just poured stuff in? I believe the number one life skill a young person can have is the creation of a job. If you can create some level of a job, to get macaroni and cheese and rice and have some level of shelter, I think more people will take more risks. And so my comments for young people is go faster, go harder, play bigger. I wish I would have had the Wendy Kopp spirit of Teacher America when I was in college, and somebody would have said, hey, Greg, let me introduce you to the top foundations in the country, and we're going to go take this idea. What we were doing with Students Today Leaders Forever was amazing. We just ran out of money. And it's because there's not a venture philanthropy industry helping us actually raise money. But in venture capital, it's organized. The capital stack is tied to each other. So for young people, let's be their customers. Let's buy their products. Let's get them donations. Let's not assume they have to be great at a philanthropy pitch and ask them all the hard questions to prove they're wrong. Let's just get behind them and celebrate the living daylights out of them.
That's a really good way of looking at it. And you think about, to where you started that discussion around, forecasts and projections and 5-year plans and all those things. And certainly in some businesses, there's some value to that. But it starts with an idea. It starts with thinking big. It starts with having a dream so big. And we actually talk about this a lot in technical education, where we have teachers that say, well, I want to do that, but I don't have a budget. And my answer to that question or that objection is always, let's come up with a dream so big that nobody can say no to it, and somebody will help you with the budget. But until you have a dream, until you have a reason, until you have something that somebody's willing to invest in, then the money's never going to come. And so I love that idea of starting with such a big idea and going fast and going hard and going at it with reckless abandon, knowing that there's always some form of a safety net, there's going to be. And so let's just dream big and let's find amazing ways that we can create ideas so big that people are willing to follow them with resources. And it's amazing what can happen. Is not thinking that way the biggest mistake that a young person can make? Is they're thinking about entrepreneurship? What mistakes would you steer them away from?
I think if I had to give some wisdom to young people, I would get back to the basics. Ron Bergen, my mentor friend, he talks a lot about be brilliant at the basics. And I think young people just do the basics. And then focus on relationships. Find people that are taking risks, solving problems that you can get to know. and then think differently about your age. I think when a young person is growing up, they're told they can't drive, they can't vote, they can't drink. They're all these things, right? You don't need a degree to solve a problem. You don't need a passport to change the world. I mean, I'm from the era that Facebook connected the world with college kids that I went to school with. I mean, you don't need all these like ageism things. Like ageism is alive and well. Right now, one of the parties has a 39-year-old as a vice presidential candidate. People are saying he's too young, whatever. I don't know. Like age does not discriminate. And so I think young people have an opportunity to say, no, we're going to create the future. And they don't need to be deputized. They don't need that. They just need to have support and encouragement. And I think my hope for them was they would start today. They would all start something, get it as far as they can. If it goes great, keep going. If they got to start over, I mean, that's the beauty of young people. Like, I mean, I remember my mentor in college saying, Greg, you're 19. Take as much risks as you can. You can start over. You're already broke. You got nowhere else to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you don't really realize that as a young person either. I mean, I think almost everybody I know, if they had to do it over again, would take more risks than when they're young. That there is that opportunity to start over. There's no shame in failing at something, in my opinion. There's shame at not going after something big enough to get you excited about doing it. And so couldn't agree more on that front. And whether you start something and it doesn't work out and you have to start over, or you start something and it becomes a world-class organization, at least you started on your journey and you'll learn it along the way and you'll figure it out along the way. Speaking of those world-class organizations, I know that's a term that's near and dear to your heart, Greg. When you think about creating a world-class organization, what does that mean? And what would you tell our audience about infusing their ideas with those types of qualities?
Well, I think one of the things that I go back to is Jerry Reinhardt, the vice provost of student affairs when I was at the University of Minnesota. And he talked about one of our developmental outcomes was tolerance of ambiguity. I am so grateful for my tolerance of ambiguity, that I can book a flight somewhere and not know where I'm going to stay, and I can figure it out. I can start something and I can take risks and all that. So I think that is what I would boil so much of this down to, is how do we help folks tolerate ambiguity? No one actually knows. No one knows is what's going to happen. We don't know who's going to win an election. We don't know what's going to happen in a war. We don't know what's going to happen with our customers. So can't we just own that? And can't we just all accept it versus this pressure to control and drive? And I just think as more people can tolerate ambiguity and then focus on relationships. This is what Putnam talks about. The more people we can get to know like us creates a lot of strength. And yet the opportunity to get to know more people unlike us creates so much opportunity, perspective, wisdom, understanding, compassion, empathy. That's the world I want to live in, where more people are connected.
You know, I've got so many friends on both ends of the spectrum, and people from, different backgrounds and people from different career choices and so on. And I've got a lot of friends that kind of grew up like I did in the same neighborhoods that I did, that I'm still friends with, and they're awesome friends, and I value and cherish those friendships. And at the same time, I've got these people that come from different backgrounds, and frankly, there's a lot more that I can learn from the people with different views and different backgrounds than what I can learn from the people that grew up just like I did. So couldn't agree more. I love that whole tolerance of ambiguity. I kind of go through life the same way. I think back to firing up the Tech Ed podcast now 3.5 years ago and having some conversations with our producer, Melissa, and we just decided one day in the fourth quarter of, I guess it was 2020, that we were going to start a podcast and do it in a world-class fashion. And she jokes and tells the story. Someday we'll have her on to tell the story about saying, okay, and then going back to her office and Googling how to start a podcast. I mean, because we really didn't have a roadmap. We just set it up and got it going, and great things have come as a result of that. So I couldn't agree more that this whole idea of being tolerant with ambiguity. In fact, the way I put it is, it's okay to go into something not knowing exactly how you're going to come out of it, just having the confidence that you're going to figure it out when the time comes. That's a lot of what entrepreneurship is all about. That's a lot about starting organizations is all about. We've had such a phenomenal conversation today on the Tech Ed podcast, such a cerebral, deep thinking, transparent, vulnerable individual, and doing amazing things at Emerging Prairie, at Grand Farm, and in so many other endeavors. Greg, I do have one last question for you before we wrap up our time today. And that is, I want to go back in time. We started this discussion about you were a farm kid growing up in literally the middle of nowhere, gravel roads, had to organize a baseball game with your friends if that was something that you wanted to do because you couldn't just, walk down the block and get a pickup game going. That's where some of these seeds of entrepreneurship started for you. But let's go back in time to that era when you're just starting high school and you're just gathering a bunch of friends to play a game on a Saturday. And if you could go back and tell that 15-year-old Greg Tehven one thing, what would that one thing be?
I would just say, be gentle, have grace, and it's going to be okay. I had the opportunity to have dinner with 28 men talking about faith and loneliness and just like this beautiful conversation with former Secretary of Agriculture to college kids. And it was just fascinating and weird. And the beauty of it for me was I drove with my best friend from when I was 6 years old. We drove out to the dinner an hour away and came back. And as we were coming home after conversations about, the challenges of parenting, the challenges of marriage, we just smiled and we just said, we're just so glad we're in it together. And I think that wisdom for 15-year-old me would be invest in your friendships, have grace with yourself, and it's going to be okay.
Yeah, be gentle, live life with grace, and kind of that maybe another G that you threw in there at the end is the gratitude of having close friends, people around you who care about you, and being able to go through a life in that fashion. It's a really, really good advice. I've had an absolute wonderful time with Greg Tehven today on the Tech Ed Podcast. He, of course, is the co-founder and CEO of Emerging Prairie. He's the board chair and co-founder of Grand Farm. You got to go see Grand Farm. It's absolutely amazing and getting even more amazing by the day. What was amazing was this time that we had together, Greg, and can't thank you enough for joining us today on the Tech Ed Podcast.
Yeah, well, thank you, Matt, and your back-end team at Melissa, and also big old thank you to the folks that support this. These podcasts take time, they take resources, and so the folks that enable this, it's a privilege for me to share my story, and I'm hopeful that the stories both today and in these millions of podcasts or downloads, you can definitely see the ripples of your work. So thanks for the courage to move forward.
Well, I appreciate those kind words. We certainly feel like we're doing great work as we do push ahead here, securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent here on the Tech Ed Podcast. And Greg's certainly doing amazing things in that space and just an incredible story. Yeah, it's so much fun on this episode. Thanks to our audience so much for joining us. All kinds of resources came up on this particular episode. Melissa, our producer, will be sure to link them all up in the show notes. As everybody knows, we have the absolute best show notes in the business. You will find them for this episode at techedpodcast.com/Tehven. That is, and catch the spelling here, it is techedpodcast.com/TEHVE. And that's where you'll find the show notes. While you are checking out those show notes, be sure to also check us out on social media. We are all over on Instagram, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on TikTok, wherever you consume your social media, you will find the Tech Ed Podcast. Connect to us, comment, let us know that you're out there. We would love to hear from you. We loved having you join us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. Until next week, I am your host, Matt Kirchner.